Welcome, and thank you for joining today's conference, Real-Time Market Overview. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the WebEx participant and chat panels by using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. Please note that all audio connections have been muted until the Q&A portion of the call. Instructions will be given at that time. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. With that, I'll turn the call over to Peter Paluzzi, Manager of Regional Affairs. Please go ahead.
Hi there, everyone, and good morning. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to go over this exciting training with us. What we're going to offer here today is a collaboration. We worked with the body of State Regulator Chair Lisa Tawney and Vice Chair Kara Hornstrom to develop this ISO Energy Imbalance Market Training specifically for commissioners. The next 2 hours will be a webinar that really covers how the EIM operates and the role that it fills for participating balancing authorities outside of California. The presentation materials were sent out with this email and invitation. They'll also be posted to our website. But just wanted to offer a quick thanks and welcome aboard, and I'd like to also turn it over to Stacey Crowley for a few words as well.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Peter. My name is Stacey Crowley. I'm the Vice President of External and Customer Affairs at the ISO. And as Peter remarked, we are all very pleased that you were able to attend today's discussion on our real-time market. Just as a reminder, we did provide an overview of our existing day-ahead market back in January of this year, and that is recorded and on our website for folks who may want to go back and that. And we plan to continue to work with BOSSR leadership to understand their needs in terms of education and other webinars as the market evolves. So I just want to thank our internal team for putting this work together. It's a good overview, and 2 hours, there's a lot of content. Thank you to Peter Paluzzi, Nikki Imam, Cindy Hinman, and Rochelle Willetts for putting this all together. So with that, I will turn it over to Cindy Hinman, who will be providing the presentation today.
Thanks, Stacey. First, can somebody just let me know if you can see my screen? You should be seeing the first slide on my presentation.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, welcome. So today we're going to go over the ISO's real-time market. We're going to focus on EIM. As Nikki mentioned, I think, or Peter, you should have gotten this presentation and also a handout with notes about what we're going to talk about today. So I already took the notes for you. If you are interested in taking notes, and you can just use this and add to it as you see fit. Let's look at the agenda for today. Okay. So we are going to go over an introduction first, and that's going to include a discussion of just the basics. What's supply and demand? What's the role of the ISO? Where does EIM, the Energy Imbalance Market, fit into that? And some terminology like scheduling coordinators, what do they do, and things like that. So we're going to set the stage so then we can move into our second part of our agenda, which is the real-time market overview, which is going to take the bulk of our time. And we're going to talk about why that market is important, what it does, how EIM fits into it. We'll follow that up with a little discussion of pricing, our locational marginal prices, what they're made up of, and how that works. And then we're going to summarize everything we talked about at the end. I will stop from time to time for questions, and I also have some of my other colleagues here to jump in and add some additional comments that may help relate this to the things that you do in your job. So let us begin. First, we're going to talk about supply and demand. So the California ISO is a grid operator and a market operator. As a grid operator, we're ensuring that there's enough supply to meet the demand. So we have this balance here, this scale, I guess, and you can see on one side is supply and the other side is demand. When I'm talking about demand, I'm talking about the load that's being consumed, the load serving entities providing the power to their customers, so keeping the lights on. So that's the load and exports. Exports also megawatts that are being consumed going out of our balancing authority. So I'm talking about the ISO balancing authority. So that's the demand side, load and exports. On the generation side, that's the suppliers. That's all the generation and all the imports into our balancing authority, if we're talking about our balancing authority. So we're always trying to maintain this balance of supply and demand. That's what our grid operators' focus is, to maintain reliability. Now, if there is more demand than supply, then we're in what's called an undersupply condition, and we need more supply put on the grid to match that demand. On the other side of the coin, we could have an oversupply condition where there's more supply than demand. And you hear about that where we're talking about curtailing generation in order to make that balance, get back in balance again. So that's the job of maintaining reliability, and that's what, as a grid operator, we do. So California ISO is a balancing authority, and so we're maintaining that balance. We're one of, I believe it's 39 balancing authorities in the Western Interconnection. There we are right there. As it says here, a balancing authority is responsible for balancing the supply of electricity with the demand in their area. So they're always making sure that there's enough power available to keep the lights on and not placing too much stress on the transmission system. Now, as I mentioned, the California ISO is a balancing authority, and we, in order to maintain that balance, we use a market as an independent system operator. There are other independent system operators in the North America, and you can see that they're all listed right here. And so we're not the only ones who try to maintain the balance in that way. You can see up in Canada, over on the East Coast, there are a lot of other ISOs, the Southwest Power Pool, there's ERCOT down in Texas. So let's talk a little bit more about the California ISO and what we do. So as I mentioned, we are a grid operator and also a market operator. So we maintain that grid reliability. We're running markets. We have a day-ahead and a real-time market that we run in order to support maintaining that grid reliability, but we do other things as well. We participate in infrastructure planning with our other energy industry partners. So we plan for the transmission needs in our balancing authority. We also support state and federal policy goals, and we're trying to align all of our goals so we can be successful and drive innovation. We provide state-of-the-art technology to ensure reliability and an efficient market for electricity. And through our markets, we're providing that market transparency. The prices are accessible, so you can see what the prices, how the prices are going. So there's market transparency in what we're dispatching and the prices. So as I mentioned, you can think of the ISO as having two main jobs, that maintaining reliability and running the market. And when I talk about being a grid operator and a market operator, this is just kind of shows that contrast. Grid operator, that they're maintaining that demand, that balance between the supply and the demand as a grid operator. And as a market operator, we are supporting that reliability through a market. We're minimizing cost and providing non-discriminatory access to the grid. And then all of the participants are getting compensated for those grid services. We're going to focus today on the market side of what we do. And so let's talk a little bit about our markets. The California ISO has two market time frames. We have the day-ahead market and we have a real-time market. So if you, as Stacy said, if you want to know more about our day-ahead market, we did do a session on that back in January, and that's recorded, and you can learn more about that. But suffice it to say, our day-ahead market runs the day before the operating day. I use the word operating day and trade day interchangeably, so if I go from one to the other, I'm meaning the day that we're talking about generating and serving the for. So, for instance, if today was the operating day, the day-ahead market ran yesterday for today, so it ran a day ahead of today. Our day-ahead market runs a day in advance, and it provides us with a schedule or a plan for what's going to happen today, what the forecast of the load's going to be, and what the generation that's planned to serve that load. But it is a day in advance. So then we have a real-time market. The real-time market are markets that run every single hour. And of course, now it's closer to real-time, so we have a load forecast that's closer to reality. So we're fine-tuning that plan from the day ahead. So it runs during the operating day. So every hour we're running markets for upcoming hours. And we'll talk more about that when we get into our next section. So today, we're going to spend most of our time talking about that real-time market, and this is where the energy imbalance market comes into play currently. So we're going to talk about EIM, but let me just show you. Currently, we have 11 active EIM entities that are participating in our real-time market. And they're doing that because the ISO market, or the Western Imbalance Energy Market, facilitates the dispatch, the effective dispatch of their resources. So we have 11 active EIM entities, and I want to say there's 9 coming on in the future, but that number seems to, I'm pretty sure it's 9, but I know it's at least 9 coming up in the next few years. So the energy imbalance market participants participate in our real-time market. Let's talk a little bit about what EIM does. So when you think of balancing authorities, they're all responsible for ensuring the reliability within their area. And if you don't have without an energy imbalance market, you're responsible for doing that by looking at all the resources that you have available in your balancing authority, and trying to maintain that balance or balance that supply and demand within the balancing authority. With EIM, we're sharing that, and there's a centralized dispatch, and it's dispatching the most efficient resources to make that balance, and it's across the balancing authorities. So, for instance, it may be more effective to dispatch a resource in Nevada to serve load in California than actually using a resource in California. Just use an example. So the centralized market is actually optimizing all the resources in EIM to determine the most efficient dispatch between all of the balancing authorities. Now, keeping in mind that ultimately those balancing authority areas, BAAs on the bottom there, balancing authority areas, are still responsible for ensuring that the load is served. Don't take that away. Now, within EIM, EIM participants are participating in our real-time market. They're also providing representation within the governance. So the California ISO has a board of governors that needs to make decisions, I think, every few months, and they are informed by the EIM governing body. The EIM governing body is 5 independent non-stakeholder members, and they hold delegated authority from the ISO Board of Governors on EIM-related initiatives. So when something comes up that we want to change in the market related to EIM, the EIM governing body is going to take a look at that, and they are going to provide the ISO Board of Governors with their input. Additionally, there is a nominating committee for the EIM Board of Governors as well. And there's also a regional issues forum. So that is a group that meets at least 3 times a year, and they discuss these EIM initiatives and may provide opinions for the governing body or the Board of Governors. Additionally, as you see there, it's a body of state regulators, and that's you. And you can also advise the EIM governing body and Board of Governors on things that interest you, on initiatives that are coming up. And you're representing, on the bottom there, all the Western EIM participants and stakeholders. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, go through a couple more slides, and then I'm going to stop for questions. When we're talking about the ISO and participants, we have our members are called scheduling coordinators. And scheduling coordinators are the entities that are authorized to transact business at the California ISO. So EIM participants need to have a scheduling coordinator to represent them. And so scheduling coordinators provide representation. They represent the supply, the load, any imports that want to participate in markets, exports. We also have something called convergence bidding, financial participants, and EIM entities also need representation through scheduling coordinators. So scheduling coordinators are certified. They go through testing. They have a checklist of all of the things that they need to do to make sure they are prepared to participate in the markets. So anybody can't just decide, oh, I think I want to put a bid in the real-time market. You actually need to go through a certified scheduling coordinator to do that. The scheduling coordinators have certain responsibilities. Per our tariff, they have the obligation to follow dispatch instructions, the obligation to pay if they're being charged, the obligation to have a 24/7 desk available for communication with the ISO. That also leads into operations. There has to be an operations desk available. And the scheduling coordinators are also responsible for the financial settlements. So an entity can become a scheduling coordinator with the ISO by going through this certification process, or they can hire a company to do that for them. And there are certain companies that do that job of being a scheduling coordinator for other entities. So in EIM, there are 2 very specific kinds of scheduling coordinators. And one of them is a participating resource scheduling coordinator, and the other one is an EIM entity scheduling coordinator. Now, here I have a slide that's talking about there are two resources in an EIM balancing authority area, and why might they be different? And one of them is a participating resource, the one on the right. That means that this resource is being used to bid into the ISO market because they're offering additional energy or a supply in the event that we need more or less. So they're offering in additional energy as a participating or bidding resource. A participating resource is represented by a participating resource scheduling coordinator. On the other side of the coin, there is the other resources in the balancing authority, the other generators that aren't going to bid into the market, but they are actually going to be running to serve the load in that balancing authority. And those are called non-participating resources. And an EIM entity scheduling coordinator represents the non-participating resources and the load in that balancing authority. So those are the 2 different kinds of scheduling coordinators, It's also the two different kinds of resources that you hear about. It's kind of unfortunate that the non-participating resource is called a non-participating resource because actually they're participating to the extent that they're providing the megawatts to maintain the balance and serve the load in that balancing authority. So I like to think of them more as bidding resources and non-bidding resources. So we talked about just some basic supply and demand concepts, what the ISO does, what EIM is, and just some terminology. And I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions before we move on into a deeper dive into the real-time market. So Kay, could you open it up and see if there are any questions?
As we move to Q&A, attendees, please unmute your device, press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. You will hear a prompt when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. Once again, pressing #2 will indicate that you wish to ask a question. There are no questions at this time.
Sounds great. Okay, so now we're going to go into the deeper dive of our real-time market, and we are going to talk about what the real-time market does. So what does it do? Here we go. So the real-time markets manage the instantaneous demand that shows up on the grid. So what is it that it does? It procures balancing energy. It's procuring that supply to meet the demand to make sure that all the lights stay on. It also maintains system security. So we're making sure that there's no overloads on the system. There's not too much congestion in an area. The real-time market also sends the dispatch signals. It says, I need you to move your supply. I need you to produce a little more megawatts, or I need you to produce a little less megawatts. And also in the ISO balancing authority only, not for EIM balancing authorities, it maintains the operating reserves. So operating reserves is that capacity that we have in the background that's available in the event that we need it, because since energy is kind of an instantaneous thing, we always need to have some waiting in the background in case we need more as capacity and not being used as something else. So what's the benefits of having a real-time market as opposed to just having bilateral contracts? Well, it's a centralized dispatch of generation. So we're gathering all the information in one place and determining the most efficient resources to dispatch. It also has economic efficiencies, again, for all. And it provides market transparency. And also, our system is redispatched every 5 minutes, so it's always looking at the most current information and making sure that we're maintaining that balance. So that's what the benefits of using a market. So I'm going to step back and talk about a big picture of the two markets that the ISO runs, and then we'll drill back down into the real-time market. So if we were to take a picture of the markets in one big picture of what the ISO does, this would be it. You can see up at the top we have our day-ahead market, and again, you can listen to that other presentation to get more details. But basically, the day-ahead market runs, and it creates a plan for the ISO Balancing Authority of what to expect for tomorrow. At 1300 or 1 o'clock, the results of the day-ahead market are published, and it triggers the opening of the real-time market. And so the real-time market runs, there's a real-time market every hour, as I mentioned, and it says T+1 after 1300, if you see that on the bottom there. That means on the trade date, the day before the trade date, starting at 1300, starting at 1 o'clock, scheduling coordinators can start submitting their bids and base schedules for each of the markets. So in the ISO Balancing Authority, the day-ahead results provide that plan for the next day. In EIM, we get that plan through what are called base schedules, and I'm going to talk about that more on the next slide. We get a plan for every hour of the supply that's going to be meeting the forecasted demand. So we have the base schedules, and also those participating resources that want to provide bids also need to put their bids in. They do that by 75 minutes before the hour, and we run a number of processes in the real-time market, and then we ultimately are clearing the market and sending out dispatches and starting up resources and shutting down resources based on the results of those markets. Finally, there's always settlements, the financial results. We get the meter data, and we are settling financially with those scheduling coordinators. So what goes into the real-time market? Well, I kind of broke it down into two different categories. There are things that we get from the ISO, and there are things that scheduling coordinators are responsible for. From the ISO, we get the information from our day-ahead schedules that plan for the next day. We also put in the forecasts into the real-time market. And when I talk about forecasts, that's the ISO continually monitoring and updating those forecasts to help accurately dispatch. So we have a demand forecast that provides the anticipated load in that next period. And we also have the renewable forecast for the wind and solar, so we can get a gauge on what will be available from our wind and solar resources. That information also goes into the real-time markets. There's the state estimator. The state estimator is a tool that looks at the state of the system at any given time and says, this is what it looks like right now, because we need that picture when we're running the market. And then we have the full network model. The full network model is like a map of our system, and it shows all the transmission and where all the generation is, and that's for the whole Western interconnection. And it models the flows in the Western interconnection, so that gets input as well. On the scheduling coordinator side, as I mentioned earlier, particularly from the EIM scheduling coordinators, we're getting those base schedules. They're letting us know how they're going to plan to serve that load. Also, those bids for additional energy, up and down. Self-schedules. A self-schedule is a kind of a bid that says, I am going to be running my resource at this particular megawatt value, and it doesn't, I don't care what the price is. Bids you're offering in for megawatts at a particular price. Self-schedules are just letting the ISO know that you plan to run that resource regardless of it. Other information that we get are outages. What if your resource is not available to provide all the megawatts, its full capacity? What if the transmission line has been derated? We need that information also, and so our scheduling coordinators provide that to us. There's another thing that is really key, and it happens before the real-time market, and that's a database that we have that contains all the attributes of all the resources. It's called the master file. And it tells the ISO, it informs the market what the characteristics or attributes of each resource. How many minutes does it take to start it up? What's the cost? How many times can you start it up a day? What type of fuel does it use? Things like that. So it's really key that we get that information on the front end correctly from our scheduling coordinators so that we can dispatch the resources properly. So those are some of the inputs that we look at when we're going to run the real-time market. I'm going to talk a little bit more here about the day-ahead schedules and base schedules. I mentioned this earlier, but they both kind of provide the same sort of information to our real-time market. They're giving us that plan for the next day of what we think we're going to be using, which resources we're going to be using, and how many megawatts to plan for tomorrow for that next. So we get the day-ahead energy schedules from the ISO's market, and we get base schedules from the EIM entities. Now, with the base schedules, we're getting these megawatt values and these resources, and we need to get some context and some tests to ensure that we have enough of what we need for each EIM balancing authority. So we have some tests that we perform on these base schedules every single hour. So every single hour we have these things called resource sufficiency evaluations. The EIM entity scheduling coordinators provide these base schedules, and we run this these tests on them. The scheduling coordinators get the results, and if they fail any of the tests, they have the opportunity to cure. They have the opportunity to adjust their base schedules. We run the test again, and I'll talk about what these 4 tests are. And again, they have the opportunity to cure that if they do not pass. And then we run it one more time and use that information when we're running the market. Now, the tests that we have, you see there's the 4 of them here. And what they do is, the first one is the feasibility test. And it ensures that the base schedules don't overload the transmission system. So it's making sure that it's feasible to supply the megawatts that are in those base schedules. There's the balancing test. So the balancing test is simply looking to make sure that there's enough supply to meet the demand, the load forecast. There's a bid capacity test. So we want a range of bids above and below that megawatt amount that we think that load forecast. And we need to ensure that there's a nice bid range that's flexible both up and down by the participating resources in each balancing authority. And then finally, there's the flexible ramp test. So we want to make sure that there's enough ramping capability to meet the slope of the demand curve, meaning that we can get from 1 megawatt value to the next in the load forecast, that we have ramping capability to get there. So if the base schedule plan that we get does not provide all of those things and they fail the test, they have the opportunity to go back and procure other resources, change their base schedules in order to ensure that they meet all 4 of these tests. So that's a little bit about base schedules and how we check the base schedules that come into the real-time market every hour. I'm going to step back and talk about bidding, which was the other thing that I mentioned. So there's not only base schedules that come in, the participating resource scheduling coordinators also can submit bids to offer to sell energy from their generator into the real-time market if it's needed. When we talk about bids, our scheduling coordinators use an application that we have, and they can put in a bid and say, I will offer 30 megawatts if the price is at least $40. They can just let us know that, or they can actually provide kind of a stepped-up bid, which is the example that you see here. And this particular example shows that this resource is starting at 50 megawatts, and it says that it's their P-min. Now, I'm not an engineer, but a P-min is the amount that a resource, a generator, can reliably run at. So they can't reliably, in this example, can't reliably run below 50 megawatts, but once they get to 50 megawatts, they can just maintain that if they need to. That's the P-min of the resource. And then the next step in this picture shows that if the price is $40, this scheduling coordinator is willing to offer 55 megawatts. And if the price is $60, which is that third arrow, if the price is $60, they're willing to offer 60 megawatts. And if the price is $120, they're willing to offer in 70 megawatts of their resource. So you can see that as the price increases, the quantity increases. So our scheduling coordinators can submit, these would be the participating resource scheduling coordinators can submit these bids. They can have up to 10 steps in them of price quantity pairs. And each one of those steps does have a minimal fee associated with it. We'll get to our grid management charges. We'll talk about that. But so this is how they let us know how much they're willing to offer or bid into the market. So that is what a bid looks like. So we take all of these bids, the market takes all of these bids, the real-time market, takes all these bids that it gets from all the scheduling coordinators for all their resources, and it stacks them up. So this green line on this slide shows all the bids all stacked up by price, and then we overlay the demand forecast on that. The market looks at demand forecast, it looks at the supply and where they cross, and those are the bids that clear the market there where I have the red circle. You'll also see at the bottom there, I've located the self-schedules. So self-schedules, as I mentioned, those are the ones that are just saying, I'm going to be running my resource, and it doesn't matter what the price is. We put them at the beginning of the bid curve, so they will be dispatched, and then we put all the other resources up above that by price. So when we start talking about pricing later, I just want to let you know that the price that we're talking about, where the demand forecast crosses the supplemental bids, that's the price for energy. And that's one component we use in our pricing. So this all works very well, but what if everybody bid the exact same amount? How would the market decide which resource to dispatch? So it's not as pure as just stacking the resources by price. We're also looking at other factors, like their startup costs, excuse me. So we don't dispatch them because they're wind or solar or some other reason. We dispatch them because we're looking at their other costs as well. And in this example, you can see the farthest one on the right there, it looks like they have the least costs of anyone. So all things being equal, that resource would be the first one we would pick to dispatch. And then after that, we've got the others, the other two, the first and the fourth one, and so on and so forth. So we're looking more than, we look at the bids first, and then we're looking at the startup costs to determine which resources that we're going to start up. And that's what the optimization does. When you hear people talking about the real-time market optimization, that's what it's going to do. So I'm going to digress a little bit into the ISO balancing authority. And at the ISO in the ISO, we have energy bids, but we also have ancillary service bids. So in EIM is an energy-only market. In the ISO, we also have ancillary services, and this slide is just saying that we co-optimize the bids and the ancillary services and pick the best fit for the market. So in this example, this resource could get dispatched for 30 megawatts of ancillary services and 50 megawatts, or probably the 70 megawatt self-schedule for energy, and then perhaps, you know, some portion of the ancillary services or some portion is energy, or we might use it all for energy. We look at the best way to use the resource and customize from whatever they bid in. And when we talk about ancillary services, which we have in the California ISO, again, we procure those in our day-ahead and real-time market, and quickly the different kinds of ancillary services that we have are regulating reserves, which are moving every 4 seconds to maintain that balance of supply and demand, and what we call contingency reserves. And that's supply that's available to provide energy within 10 minutes. That's that waiting in reserve or operating reserves waiting to be available in the event that we need to convert them to energy. We pay our resources for providing those services. So we run the real-time market. We produce the results for our balancing authority and for all the EIM entity balancing authorities. And the outputs of the real-time market come in 3 formats, if you will, 3 time frames. So first, every hour, we're going, an EIM entity scheduling coordinator and the participating resource scheduling coordinator is going to receive advisory instructions. Here's what it looks like. We're going to need you to produce in the next hour. This is not binding. It's just advisory. Now, every 15 minutes, we're running a market called the 15-minute market, or the acronym that we use lots of acronyms. It's the FMM. In the FMM, we are starting up resources and shutting them down. We're going to need you to start up your resource at this time, or we're going to need you to shut down your resource for resources that can start up in that time frame. And then every 5 minutes, we run the real-time dispatch. The real-time dispatch, RTD, is the increase or decrease of output. We need you to provide us a few more megawatts from that resource, or we need you to provide a few less megawatts from that resource. It runs every 5 minutes, and so it's looking into the future. So let's take a closer look at the real-time dispatch process. So we've got all these 5-minute intervals, as you can see. And let's say we're talking about this interval right here. We're interested in seeing how this one works. Well, 7.5 minutes before this 5-minute interval, the real-time market runs for that 5-minute interval. It optimizes for that interval. It's picking the best resources based on the forecast that we have. And then it is at 2.5 minutes before that interval, it's actually dispatching it, saying, okay, move that resource up by however many megawatts or move it down. As you can imagine, that same time frame we're optimizing for the next interval. And we actually are doing an optimization for up to 13 intervals out. So it's kind of an iterative process. We're always updating what that dispatch is, and then 2.5 minutes before the interval, we're giving that instruction to the resource saying, this is what we need you to do. So it continues on, as you see here. So this is how the real-time market works, and that's really the process. But there are some other things that the real-time market needs to do. We need to make sure that there's a available ramping capability to get to the next point on our time frame. So if you take a look at this, there's something called the flexible ramping product. And as it says, it provides additional upward and downward ramping capability. So here we have, the bottom of this graph is time, and then we've got megawatts. So at a particular time, there's an energy schedule of a certain amount of megawatts. And you can see the blue line shows this is where the amount of energy we think we're going to need at that some future time frame. So that is the load forecast. That's where we're going to dispatch the resource to go in the next 5 minutes. However, it is only a forecast, and so it could be wrong. We could need more energy or less energy, or maybe it goes up and down between getting from that first spot to the second spot. So we need additional capacity on hand to fill any potential gaps that we might have, and that's known as the uncertainty. And you can see here, that's the red and the green. So we're looking at the blue line is where we're planning on dispatching the next interval of energy, but we also have in the wings other capacity to meet that uncertainty of where it might go. Now we look at historical trends of all the different possible places where it might go. A good analogy is when you're looking at when the hurricane forecast and you're watching the news, and it shows the path of that hurricane going up the coast of the east coast of the United States, but it also has kind of a teardrop shape around it of all the other places it might go based on the forecast. That's kind of the same thing here. That's the uncertainty of the other places where that hurricane might land. Another thing we need to make sure is that no resources have market power. So what do I mean by market power? Well, if you look, here's our little town on the hill here, and there are three types of generation, or three generators supplying megawatts to serve the load, or offering to supply megawatts to serve the load of that little town on the hill. So they want their prices to be competitive. So there's competition here. So that keeps their prices low. But let's say there was only one generator. Well, then that generator could say, well, you know what? I don't need to charge $30, $35, or $40. I can charge $70 because that little town on the hill has no choice but to take my energy. So there's no competition, and that is what's known as market power. When we run our markets, the first thing we do is we take in all the bids and we run a test of the market to see if any particular resource could potentially have market power, and we will then mitigate. We may we'll take a look at what they're bidding in and may adjust their bids to ensure that they're covering their costs, but they're not gouging the market in any way. So we will mitigate bids for if the event occurs that there could be market power. So that's a way to ensure that nothing gets out of whack as far as the prices go. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, when we run the market, after the market runs and after the energy is produced and the load is served, we get all the meter data from the resources, and we then do settlements. And that's the financial outcome of who is getting paid and who is paying. So there are, if you want to know more about settlements, there's day-long courses about settlements. But let me just give you a little high-level idea of how we do settlements for an EIM resource. In the picture we have here in the bottom, we have a settlement interval of an hour, every 5 minutes of an hour. And then we're looking at a resource that had a base schedule of 120 megawatts. So that's that blue bar at the bottom. It says they had schedule or base schedule, but let's say this is an EIM participant. They provided a base schedule of 120 megawatts. Now the ISO doesn't settle that base schedule. That happens within the balancing authority, but we will settle any dispatches above that or any deviations from that. So let's say resources base schedule is 100 megawatts, and then we get the meter after the hour runs or after the day, and we find out they actually produced 120 megawatts. Well, there will be a settlement for that 20 megawatts. They may be paid or charged depending on what the price is, the locational marginal price is for that hour. So in this example, the base schedule is 120 megawatts. And then in the FMM, they were dispatched for another 14 megawatts. Nope, 24 megawatts. I teach settlements. I should be able to add. And we have here 4 15-minute intervals in my example here. They all are nicely even, which is not necessarily what happens, but I use this in settlements training, and it's easier for calculating. So the FMM could be, dispatch could be different in every 15-minute interval. And then in every hour, the resource was dispatched for each 5-minute interval. And you can see there's 12 5-minute intervals in this example, and the resource was dispatched up to 156 megawatts. So there are different settlements for each one of these. They're paid out at different rates, different prices. And so that's what a scheduling coordinator would see on their bill. Now, another settlement, and I mentioned it earlier, is we have something called our grid management charge. The ISO is a nonprofit public benefit corporation, so we charge a fee on every megawatt that flows on the grid. So that's how we recover our costs through what's called a grid management charge, or GMC. Now, in the ISO Balancing Authority, I'm going to talk about those charges first. We have a market services charge, and that's based on what was scheduled in the market. So that has to do with the bids and schedules that the participants put in. And so then there's also a charge based on what flowed. So we're going to look at the meter data, and based on the megawatts of flowed, we're going to associate a charge with each one of those. We also have a charge for congestion revenue rights, which is part of our day-ahead market, and there is a charge having to do with the auctions and the CRR's features. And finally, there is participation in the energy imbalance market, and that charge that we have, grid management charge for the energy imbalance market, is actually a market services charge and a system operations charge, and we combine them and put them in this one charge for the energy imbalance market. We don't use the same charges that we use for our EIM, for our ISO Balancing Authority participants, because they're not utilizing the same part or percentage of the market. So there's a separate charge for EIM participants to use our services. So I'm going to stop here and break for questions about the real-time market. I went over it really quickly. So let's take some time for questions before we move on to the pricing.
As a reminder,
and if any of my colleagues want to add anything also to this, they're welcome to jump in.
As a reminder, attendees, please unmute your device, press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue.
This is Commissioner Tawney, and while we're waiting to see if anyone queues up, I wonder if you could go back to the slides where you had an asterisk that said this is not EIM related. I think it was the ancillary market, and so on. Those are related to how you think about setting up the day ahead and so on. But could you talk a little bit more about when you say CAISO only and does not apply to EIM, how we should think about that as EIM entities regulators?
Sure. So as a balancing authority, the ISO itself is responsible for ensuring the reliability of our balancing authority. And so we're responsible to make sure that there's enough supply to meet the demand, but we're also responsible to make sure that we have enough megawatts waiting in the background as capacity, known as ancillary services, in the event that we need more energy. So the ISO has the energy and the ancillary services. In an EIM balancing authority, EIM is that those balancing authorities are using the ISO for the energy portion of their reliability, and they have other mechanisms to ensure that they have that additional capacity available. So that's not part of EIM, but we do, in our balancing authority, we run a market for the participants in our balancing authority to ensure that we have that capacity through ancillary services.
So within an hour, a VA is taking in the dispatch instructions in the 5-minute increment from the EIM, but then falling back to however they've organized their ancillary services if they have a hiccup, a change in load, a change in supply in that 5-minute window. So we're sort of moving day ahead, they do on their own, in the hour, and up to in the 5-minute, they do with the KISO algorithms. Then within the 5-minute, if something happened that 4-second, they're doing that back again on their own with whatever reserve sharing or something that they've organized. Am I sort of
right? So the
in and out of these types of Go ahead.
So the ISO, what you're saying is correct. The ISO has a requirement that we meet for the ancillary services that we believe that we're going to need in order to maintain a condition that we always have enough capacity available, and other balancing authorities do that for themselves as well. I'm sorry, go on.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. It's helpful to understand where these intersections are in finer grain. So that's really helpful. Thank you.
Right, and the key point is that for EIM, we're only talking about energy. The market is only for the energy piece. Right. So whatever financial arrangement they may come to for the ancillary services, they're doing that outside of the KISO algorithm, the KISO footprint, or the regional footprint. They're looking to their own whatever arrangements they've historically used, whether that's the Northwest Power Pool or Bilateral or whatever. They're arranging that as a BA for themselves. That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions?
There are no questions at this time.
All right, well, let's move on to pricing. And we are ahead of schedule, which is good. And we're going to talk about, so we run this market, and we talked about dispatching resources and finding the most efficient resources to keep the supply meeting the demand. The next thing we're going to talk about is how do we price those megawatts? So we have something called nodal pricing. And what nodal pricing means is that we have prices for every what we call a node. So this is just a representation here, but let's say all these little G's were generators. Each one of them would be considered a node, and a price would be calculated for each generator, and the prices could be different for all of them. So that's generator nodal pricing. And as the rules go, for load-serving entities, they're aggregating all those load nodes and have an aggregated price here called a LAP, a load aggregation point. And this is just an example here. NV Energy, again, just a representation where the circle represents the LAP, the load aggregation point, and there's a price, one price associated with those load nodes. For imports and exports, we are actually looking at the point where they cross, in this example, cross the border in and out of California, and there's a price associated with that. So each one of these types of nodes or aggregated nodes has a price associated with it. That price is called a locational marginal price. Location, where they're located, and the marginal price, and it determines the most cost-effective resources. Now, the locational marginal price traditionally consisted of energy, congestion, and losses, and then we added a greenhouse gas adder for the EIM participants, and we're going to talk about that, but first we're going to talk about the energy congestion and losses, and we'll do the greenhouse gas piece last. So starting with energy, if you remember, I mentioned there was a graph where we stacked all of the bids, and then where it crossed where the load forecast crossed those bids, that stack of bids, that would be the price for energy. So that's our first component of the LMP. What you're looking here is a map taken off of our ISO Today app, actually, or you can look at it on our website, and it's a heat map for pricing. So it looks like on May 3rd of 2018, for our ending 12, the interval 11, which is the second last interval, I'm looking up at the very top of this, that's how I'm getting that. The marginal price for energy is $6.15. I have called out 3 nodes that happen to be there, and you can see the energy price for each one of them is $6.15. So when we calculate the price for energy, when we run our markets, the price is universal throughout the entire EIM area. So that includes the ISO. The price is the same everywhere. So you can see price $6.15. So that is the energy price. Next component is congestion. The congestion component can be different in every single node depending on the congestion in that area. So congestion has to do with whether, like with traffic, can the megawatts flow freely, or maybe the transmission line only can move 100 megawatts, and you can't put 102 megawatts through there, you can only put 100 or something less than that. So that would be congestion. So potential causes of congestion are lack of transmission capacity and transmission outages. And you can see here with all 3 of these resources, they have different congestion costs. You'll see that the one that's the furthest right, the one Davis _1, has a congestion cost of 0, congestion price. And that indicates that there's just no congestion. The megawatts can flow freely. When you look at the one that has up at the top, that is $4.52 of congestion. So the congestion component is higher than 0, and it means that this node is downstream from a constraint. And if you tried to flow energy from this generator, you're going to be reducing system congestion. So you're more valuable. So the price is higher for congestion. So ultimately, the locational marginal price, the price that generator will get paid, is going to be higher than potentially other resources. Now you see the one on the bottom, the congestion price is negative. Now that node would actually be contributing to congestion if they flow the megawatts from that generation. So it's kind of, the price ends up in this example actually going negative, and so it's discouraging that resource from generating. So that is how the congestion is calculated, or what it means in the locational marginal price. Finally, there are losses, and losses are calculated. We have that full network model that I mentioned that has a map of the transmission system and how all the energy would flow, and when you inject megawatts into the transmission system, what comes out on the other side is something less because of losses. So we translate those losses into financially, and you can see that the losses are different for each one of these resources. So if we look at the locational marginal prices here, you can see the one at the top, that resource will get paid $10.76 for its megawatts, while the one in Davis is $6.34 locational marginal price, and the Wolfskill is the locational marginal price is actually negative. That means if they generate, they're going to be charged $2.30. So that explains the energy, congestion, and losses. Finally, we have this greenhouse gas, a component of the locational marginal price. So what is that? Well, California has this carbon emission reduction program administered by CARB, the California Air Resources Board, and all resources that serve California load are charged to provide that generation. So it applies to all resources that emit greenhouse gases and serve load in California. So that includes the generation in our balancing authority and also generation exported from an EIM entity into California. So an EIM participating resource that offers their supply to serve California load are able to recover the costs of the greenhouse gas to submit to CARB for complying with the carbon emission program. Now, they can choose to do that or they can choose not to by the way their bids are structured. So if you are a participating resource and you want to offer megawatts into the market and into California as well, you're going to put in your bid for however many megawatts at whatever price, and you're also going to put in your price for your greenhouse gas adder and an amount of megawatts there. That's going to let the ISO know or the market know that you are interested in or willing to provide your megawatts to California if that's the optimal resource to be dispatched. On the other hand, a resource can choose not to provide their generation to California by simply, when they put in their offer for their megawatts and price, they don't put anything in the greenhouse gas adder space. They leave that blank, and that's telling the market we are not offering our megawatts into California. So that's how it works. And so within this, the EIM resources will recover that cost of greenhouse gas compliance. So here's a little example. So the EIM resource is awarded 1 megawatt, and that megawatt is delivered to the ISO balancing authority. The LMP for the energy is $40, and that $40 is based on an energy congestion loss component, $30 for energy, congestion is $10, losses are $2, and the greenhouse gas component ends up being negative $2. So greenhouse gases are $2. And what happens is the greenhouse gas piece is a negative number so that the EIM resources aren't unfairly, they aren't being charged more, but they will recover that greenhouse gas bit in another charge. They're actually settlement. They're going to get paid that $2 in another, what we call a charge code. So they're going to recover the cost of that $2 to use for their greenhouse gas compliance. So that I know it's a kind of a hard concept, but that's how the greenhouse gas bit works. So that is the last thing I was going to talk about pricing. We talked about LMPs, energy, congestion, loss, the greenhouse gas component, and nodal pricing. And Kay, I'm going to open it up for questions again.
As we move to Q&A, attendees, please unmute your device. Press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. You will hear a prompt when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. Once again, pressing #2 will indicate that you wish to ask a question. There are no questions at this time.
All right.
This is Commissioner Tani. Can I break in with a question?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I wonder, can you, I know the GHG adder can be really confusing for us who are not familiar with CARB. Can you help us understand how we know our customers are not paying a GHG adder for resources at this point? I know our states have differing rules and targets and goals around clean energy or GHGs, but right now none of us have a synced up market with you, with CAISO, in terms of, or with CARB, I should say, not with CAISO, but with CARB in terms of GHG pricing. Can you help us understand how our customers are not paying that GHG adder if we're outside the California BA or the California CARB regulatory footprint?
So I'm going to ask for Peter's help on this, but currently our system is only looking at the California Air Resources Board program for compliance to that. We're not considering other compliance programs in other states. So there's more through our market. We're not charging or collecting anything for any other compliance programs other than, actually we're not collecting from that for the California Resources Board, but we are providing payment to you for that. So I don't know, Peter, do you want to add additional information into that, or Phil?
Sure, Cindy. Let me, well, Commissioner Tani, I think that the easiest way to think about it is for all resources within California, the cost to comply with the Air Resources Board program is already included in their bids that they make for the market. With this additional component of the locational marginal price that we've included, what that really does is it sets it at parity. And those payments that come from California load to generators outside the state of California, it is the way that is handled. So none of the load outside of California is responsible for those compliance mechanisms, and that GHG payment is sufficient to compensate those generators for any load or any energy that is deemed delivered to Cal load. So, you know, Oregon, Washington, et cetera, those folks don't end up paying that amount. It is actually just the California Load Center that does.
Hey, Peter, this is Phil. Can I chime in maybe with a little bit of an example?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure thing, Phil.
Okay. So I think it's a great question, Commissioner, and maybe what we can do is construct a quick example on the fly, always a little dangerous, but to try to help point out where the money goes. As both Cindy and Peter have been describing, if we think about a generator outside California that is able to produce energy, or contrast that to a generator inside California, Peter's answered the question that the unit inside California doesn't even have an explicit greenhouse gas adder. They just incorporate it into their energy bid because any megawatt hours produced are going to be subject to CARB's tracking mechanism. What we've done with EIM is we've made it a secondary component in the bids that come to us from that generator that's outside California. Because what our market will do is it will look at that particular generator and determine why is the generator being increasing its output. And so in trying to optimize then the dispatch in this 5-minute basis, if that generator is going to be ramped up, let's say 100 megawatts of additional energy, what the market is doing is determining why is that generator being ramped up. And as Peter just said, if it's for the purpose of serving California load, then the price that we're going to look at is, back to Cindy's example, it's the, a $30 energy price, but it may also include a $2 GHG adder to it. So in fact, it's really a $32 bid price. And if that generator clears, then the LMP will reflect that higher bid price. And what that means then is California consumers will be paying the additional $2 to cover now the compliance obligation that that generator has. Now, in contrast, If the generator is being ramped up to serve load outside California, that 100 megawatts is clearly not serving the benefit of California consumers. And so now the generator is going to be evaluated in the market at its plain $30 price. And there is no GHG adder to that. And so it's very likely then that the generator may run to serve external load, and it would then get paid just the $30 price. And you see the point is that external load has no GHG obligation because it was not part of making the dispatch decision and part of the market optimization. So I hope that helps kind of characterize how we determine, first of all, what's the clearing price, but to the extent it clears at a higher price because it's serving California load, the generator gets the revenue to cover that GHG cost because that's what they told us they needed, and ultimately it cleared. But if the generator was running for external load, there is no GHG cost to be collected from consumers. Is that helpful?
That's really helpful. I think understanding how you're ensuring both that there's a sort of level playing field within the, but also within the construct of a different regulatory regime for the California load versus our other states that don't have a price on carbon at this point is it's tricky, and it's something we sort of always trip over as we think across the whole West. And so I think that's a helpful articulation. Is there, is this, does this play out in part because of the, and maybe this is a bridge too far, but because of the LMP on the, you've got LMP at the generator, but there's also, you're tying generators to load. You know to some degree what you're trying to connect, why you're bringing the generator into the system, what load it's trying to go out and meet. And so you're differentiating by load. That is really fundamental to how you're thinking about this, even if it's maybe a little bit artificial because of how the electrons actually flow. You are really trying to differentiate the loads that are pulling on the system.
So we're looking at a load forecast, and there are, as you say, the megawatts flow wherever they flow, and so we determine how much needs to be injected into the transmission system, looking at the full network model to serve that load.
Well, and the other way to think about it is once we get to the 5-minute standpoint, clearly we do have a more near-time forecast we're using. But I think maybe one way to think about this is the I in the EIM. What the market is doing is looking at where are the imbalances. And I think, Commissioner Tawney, you're right in the sense that if California balancing area has an imbalance of that 100 megawatts, then the energy needs to come from either generators within that balancing area or from any of the adjacent balancing areas that are part of the EIM market. And so as a result, then, we're looking at those transfers from outside California into California. And that's what helps then determine what's the right pricing and then the right cost allocation.
That's helpful. That's really helpful. Thank you for elaborating on it. I think it's something that we will continue to grapple with around the West as we think about our own state's policy goals, whatever they are, and how they play out in the EIM for both our generators and our loads. So appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. Kay, are there any other questions?
There are no questions at this time.
Okay. So let's wrap it up and go into our final section of bringing it all together.
I'm so sorry.
Just to I'm sorry?
There's one question in the queue.
All right.
One moment, please.
Hi, this is Cynthia Hall, Commissioner, New Mexico. When you mentioned balancing authority, I apologize. It reminds me of a question that arose in my mind when you were talking about balancing authorities a little bit earlier on. I wonder if I could just ask this question. You mentioned balancing authorities are responsible for reliability within their balancing area. And I was wondering if it's appropriate in looking at the reliability within your balancing area to look at the market as a source of potential backup capacity with respect to the balancing authority's reliability, the balancing area reliability. How is the market and participation of utilities within the balancing area? How is their involvement in the market treated with respect to the reliability needs within their balancing authority?
So when I think of the market with respect to the energy imbalance market, it is a tool that a balancing authority uses to dispatch in the most efficient way. So I feel like, there's still that larger responsibility to reliability. And Phil or Peter, do you want to jump in and add into that?
Sure. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, Commissioner Hall, I think it's great. So the way that we look at it, the energy imbalance market, like Phil had mentioned earlier with the I, handles the imbalance. So that's that within hour change between generation and load that we're trying to meet. But with that being said, the energy imbalance market is an energy-only market. So there, in order to make sure that it functions properly, we have some checks and balances in place to make sure that all of the participants or those balancing authority areas have sufficient resources to meet all of their needs. So each one of the balancing authority areas comes in with a balanced schedule. So they have enough resources online to meet their forecasted needs plus contingency reserves. And what we do as the market operator is we dispatch those resources up and down. So unlike what you may see perhaps in some other fully integrated markets where some of those entities can come in expecting market purchases to provide those reliability benefits, in the imbalance market as it is today, we're just managing those fluctuations. We don't actually function as a reliability source for that energy.
Okay. Thank you.
This is Phil Pettengill. I think the one thing I wanted to add is if we come back a little bit larger than where Peter was at, as we've talked about, the energy imbalance market is only providing the energy. But in one of Cindy's slides, she talked about the need for ancillary services. And as Peter said, the EIM does not clear those. It's really important to recognize that even in the day-ahead market that the ISO is running for our balancing area, we will procure ancillary services from that day-ahead market to meet the balancing area obligations. And I think the key thing to think about here is, well, where do those obligations derive from? And the short answer is these are NERC reliability standards that are promulgated by them on behalf of FERC. So FERC is setting the reliability standards, and the balancing areas are obligated to follow those rules, requirements, and obligations. There's a number of different ways that different balancing areas do that. But I think to get to the heart of your question, what's important to recognize is the markets as we're talking about here today in themselves do not have any requirements for generator owners to provide their product into the market. There's not an obligation inherent in the market. That obligation comes from any other mechanism. And so, for example, what's happening here in the rest of the Western interconnection now is a much broader conversation about resource adequacy. And what I'll just simply say is, in order to make sure that there's enough resources in the area, in particular for California as an example, the California ISO balancing area works with the California Public Utilities Commission, the other municipal entities, in establishing resource adequacy requirements. And the resources that are procured under that program, they then have a must-offer obligation into the market. And if they don't clear the day-ahead market, those obligations extend into this real-time market that we've been talking about today. So while the markets optimize the dispatch, the real obligation comes from something outside the market, such as a resource adequacy program. So I hope that didn't complicate things too much, but I wanted to get to the heart of your question, which is really where does reliability come from? And it's in a way sort of a two-part process. The forward planning and procurement then gets handed off to an optimization that can occur in the day-ahead and real-time markets.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's really very, very clear, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very much.
Thank you, Phil. Kay, are there any other questions?
There are no questions at this time.
All right. Well, we are going to bring it home. And again, if there are any questions, we're going to be available at the end here to take any other further questions. But just to recap, you can see here we have that energy imbalance market. And it is part of the ISO's real-time market. The ISO, as a market operator, has both a day-ahead and real-time market. And the California ISO is not only a market operator, but we are a grid operator as well. So the California ISO runs the energy imbalance market through our real-time market for balancing authorities that wish to participate. So jumping back into the energy imbalance market and what it is a real-time wholesale energy trading market. And the benefits are that centralized, optimized dispatch, the economic efficiency and diversity that brings to those balancing authorities. As I mentioned, it's just another tool in that toolkit for balancing authorities. And the participants in EIM come in two flavors as far as scheduling coordinators. The EIM entity scheduling coordinator that's responsible for the balancing authority role, and the non-participating resources, those that are not bidding into our market. The other is the EIM participating resource scheduling coordinator. Those are the ones that are responsible for the participating resources, or those that are submitting bids into our real-time market every hour. Finally, the tools that those scheduling coordinators use include the base schedules and bids that they're submitting to inform the ISO, the market, what they're going to be using to cover that demand based on the forecast, and the bids that they're going to be using to cover the deviations, or as we mentioned, the imbalances. Finally, we have the ISO performs resource sufficiency tests to make sure that those tools, the bids and base schedules, are sufficient to cover the next hour, and some balancing authorities won't be leaning on others to ensure that there's enough energy available. So this is our map of our EIM entities, the active ones and the ones that are planned for the coming years. And finally, if you really want to learn more, there are plenty of ways to get involved in the California ISO to learn more about any of these topics. The first one we have here is the Policy Initiatives Roadmap. So every year, the ISO gathers policy requests from stakeholders and from internally all of the things that need to initiatives that could or should happen. And we publish them every year. And then we determine what we're going to do, and we create this policy initiatives roadmap. So you can certainly take part in the stakeholder process when we are reviewing that policy issues roadmap. Our stakeholder processes are open to the public. You can dial in and provide comments. It's an open forum in our stakeholder meetings, any of them, almost any of them. You can also get involved in our initiative process. We do have future EIM initiatives coming. There's called The next one's called Eim Enhancements 2020. If you're interested in knowing what's coming up in 2020, what we're going to be enhancing or improving with EIM, you can certainly look on our website and get involved in shaping that or learning about it as we move along. I mentioned the EIM governance process at the beginning of our discussion when we were setting the stage, and certainly we have a schedule for those meetings. The information along with our Board of Governors meetings is posted on our website, so they are available to listen into. I guess Peter or anyone else, is there anything else you wanted to add about getting involved in the ISO processes?
Well, thanks, Cindy. That's great. We do also have some opportunities for the body of state regulators members. As we've said, you've gotten great monthly calls that are hosted by Chair Tawney and Vice Chair Fornstrom. There's also the assistance of Maury Galbraith and the rest of the Western Interstate Energy Board team. Like Cindy just mentioned, we do have the EIM governance process. It's good to note that that everyone has full access to all of our EIM governing body members. They have the opportunity to participate in all of our open meetings, that all of the information that we utilize through this decisional process and through our stakeholder process is published on our website and available for review. And also, you've got all of us here on the phone available to help out with any questions that you might have about what's going on in the process there.
Okay. And if you do have any questions about the training or the materials, you can contact me through the customer readiness at caiso.com email, or you can visit our website for more information. That is all that I have. So I'm going to open it up to final questions, if there are any.
As a quick reminder, attendees, please unmute your device, press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue.
Cindy, in the interim, while we're waiting for folks, just in case there's any last-minute questions, I did want to hop on and let you guys know that all the recordings from today's webinar, along with posting of the presentation, as well as a notes page, will be posted on the Western EIM.com website under the Body of State Regulators tab located at the bottom there. That's where we are storing all of that information, so we can go ahead and review that at any time that you'd like. If you did find the information helpful, we do recommend that you can give out those links or that information to any of your colleagues or coworkers that you think might find that helpful. And we also did miss Commissioner Tawney on the front end and wanted to give her the opportunity to perhaps wrap it up with a few words if she'd like as well.
Thank you so much, Peter, and apologies that I wasn't able to join as we opened this. And instead, I can only thank you all. These trainings are really crucial for body of state regulator members and for our staff. We have a range of states that are still coming up to speed as their facilities implement. And we have 6 years of all learning together ahead of us still yet. And these resources that the CAISO is leading are really will have lasting usefulness as we all work through that process together. I also want to thank some of the EIM governing body members for joining us today. I'm glad we can do this learning journey together and really maximize use of the CAISO's training capacity and excellent resources there. I think as we get to grips with how the West is regionalizing these sorts of sessions, particularly recording them, and as Peter encouraged us passing those links to our staff and our colleagues is incredibly important. This is only going to become more integrated as we go along. The economic benefits that we have seen already and that we will continue to see mean there's a lot of value in putting time and energy in understanding this and working to continuously improve it over time as we all work together to keep the system healthy as it moves through this transition, integrating more and more renewables and adapting to a wide range of state policies around the West. So I really want to thank the CAISO training team. They've really gone the extra mile for us as WASR members in adapting training that can be quite technical and geared towards market participants to the kinds of questions and issues that we have as regulators. And I really appreciate them bringing their teaching skill to that new space. Ahead market sessions that I encourage you to go and look at, and also this session. So with all those thanks, Peter, let me hand it back to you.
Well, thanks, Commissioner Tawney. And I don't know if we ended up with any additional questions.
There are no questions at this time.
Okay. Well, thank you.
I'd like to just add in one other thing. This is Cindy. So I wanted to mention as Peter said, the recording will be posted. It'll probably take a few days before it's on our website, but please check back to make sure in a few days to find it. Also, we'll be sending out a survey, and it really helps me to understand if we hit the mark or not. What we did good and what we could do better. So I really encourage you to fill that out and return that. You should get that in your email. Peter, I'm handing it back to you.
Thanks, Cindy. Well, yeah, again, we just wanted to thank everyone for their participation today. If you've got any other ideas for other informational topics that you'd like us to include, we definitely recommend that we pass those along. We're happy to facilitate these as often as makes sense. And that's about all we've got for today. So just wanted to wrap it up there and thank you again.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, CAISO team.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.